concluded in accordance with Standing Order 43. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the Morrison-Joyce government's so-called plan for net zero comes with net zero modelling, net zero costs beyond 2030 and net zero legislation?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that our plan for achieving net zero emissions by 2050, Mr Speaker, the extensive plan that we've released, Mr Speaker, will achieve that, and we'll achieve that, Mr Speaker, by backing the decisions that Australians are making, particularly across our corporate sector, across, Mr Speaker, our scientific community, that understands the technological changes that will take place and that we will fund and support through the low emissions technology roadmap, Mr Speaker, and the many other initiatives that we've outlined as a government. That is what gets us to net zero by 2050. What doesn't get us there, Mr Speaker, is taxes and mandates and laws telling people what to do and what they can't do, Mr Speaker, on their farms, in their businesses, in their factories, in their homes, Mr Speaker. That's not what our plan does. The reason Labor doesn't like our plan, Mr Speaker, is because there's no taxes in it. They don't like our plan, Mr Speaker, because there's no mandates telling people what to do and regulations trying to control their lives. That's why Labor doesn't like our plan, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our commitment was set out at the last election. We said we would have a 26 to 28% reduction by 2030. The Labor Party said 45% was the emissions reduction that should occur by 2030. The Australian people rejected that, Mr Speaker, but we note today, on the same logic that those opposite often put on those on this side of the House, today the Labor Party supported the member for Ringa for a 60% reduction.
No, just say
a 60% reduction, Mr Speaker.
If the Leader of the Opposition can resume his seat, I was about to intervene. As I've made clear on numerous occasions, the Prime Minister needs to be relevant to the question. He wasn't asked about alternative policies. I've been lenient in terms of comparing and contrasting, but just to be very clear, it's not an opportunity to talk about what was voted on earlier today in terms of alternative policies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So, the building blocks of the plan which we outlined yesterday, Mr Speaker, the emissions reduction fund, some $2.5 billion, the top-up of that fund by a further $2 billion, the delivery of Snowy 2.0 at $1.4 billion, Marinus Link, Mr Speaker, the energy efficiency improvements, the grid reliability fund, some $1 billion on energy generation, storage, transmission and grid transitions, the hydrogen industry development plan of $1.2 billion, the carbon capture and storage hubs, which we believe, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, Labor is voting against carbon capture and storage, Mr Speaker, in this parliament, the ARENA funding of $1.4 billion, continued funding and an expanded mandate, the gas-fired recovery projects, the King Review safeguard mechanism, Mr Speaker, the international technology partnerships, some $565 million, with India being added to those, Mr Speaker, with Japan, the United Kingdom and others, Mr Speaker, Germany. So these are the initiatives the government is undertaking to get to net zero by 2050. We still don't know what their 2030 target is, and they don't have a plan for any of it.
The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. South Australians, like those in communities across Barker, will soon look forward to their borders reopening so families can reunite, businesses can ramp up and more people can get back to work. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how this news demonstrates the Morrison government's national plan is working so we can safely live with the virus and build a stronger Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Barker for his question. As a proud South Australian, he'll be proud of his state today because today South Australia exceeded 80% on first-dose vaccinations. Australia has now passed the United Kingdom on first-dose vaccinations across whole of population. Mr Speaker, we have had one of the lowest fatality rates of COVID-19 in the world. We have had one of the strongest, particularly amongst advanced economies, of economies going through COVID in the world, and we're on track, Mr Speaker, to have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. And today, Mr Speaker, we know that the TGA has approved the go forward on the booster program, Mr Speaker, for our vaccinations. And I was talking to Jane Malashak today. You may remember Jane out at the Marion. She joined me for that first dose of the vaccine, Mr Speaker, and we spoke about getting together again for that booster shot, which we'll be able to have, Mr Speaker, as the plan is rolled out by the Minister for Health together with Professor Murphy, Mr Speaker, and we will continue that program. She was particularly pleased to hear that within about a week and a half, Mr Speaker, that Australia is likely to hit 80% double-dose vaccination around the country, which is in line, Mr Speaker, with what the Minister for Health and others were saying at the beginning of this year. So, Mr Speaker, that program means that we're able to open up. We're able to open up under the national plan, as the member for Barker was asking about, Mr Speaker, and South Australia has joined so many other states now in outlining their timetable to open up their state under the national plan, which is being achieved by those vaccination rates continuing to rise all around the country, and we want to see those rates rise, particularly in Queensland, Western Australia, Mr Speaker, and we'll continue to work with those states to achieve those outcomes. On Monday, Mr Speaker, Australians will be taking off again. Australians will be taking off as the international restrictions on travel by vaccinated Australian residents and citizens is lifted, and there's more than 500,000 Australians who have already downloaded their international vaccination certificate, Mr Speaker, which will enable them to do that. We'll be concluding very, very shortly our arrangements with Singapore, which we'll see next month, particularly students, Mr Speaker, and business travellers being the first to come to Australia out of Singapore who are double vaccinated, and we welcome the announcements made today in Singapore about Australians being able to travel there from the 8th of November. And by the end of the year, Mr Speaker, I fully anticipate that we'll be able to achieve seeing international visitors, including backpackers, Mr Speaker, who are double vaccinated, being able to come back to Australia, and I know that'll be great news to the Minister for Agriculture in particular and the many others around the country who rely on them. The national plan, Mr Speaker, is working. Australia's taking off on Monday, Mr Speaker. Australia has passed the UK in single-dose vaccinations. We are moving forward strongly under the national plan.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. This morning, Treasury told Senate estimates it had not modelled the impact of the government's net zero policy. Why didn't the Prime Minister ask Treasury to model the impact? Why won't the Prime Minister release the modelling he claims to have?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Modelling will be released in the next couple of weeks, Mr Speaker. The Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources is the department that does the modelling on this work, Mr Speaker, and was supported by that work by Treasury, and I'll ask the Treasury to update further.
Member for Kingston Smith and others. The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Treasury did provide advice to DISA, who undertook the modelling. In fact, they seconded Treasury officials to DISA for the purposes of assisting with that modelling, and my department stayed in close contact with DISA throughout that modelling process. With respect to the advice that Treasury provided to DISA, was about the risk premium of not joining the global consensus around net zero by 2050, and it was also about some of those long-run assumptions like population growth that was taken into account with respect to the DISA modelling. But the point I want to make, Mr Speaker, is that the Coalition, in the announcement of our plan to reach net zero by 2050, has put in place a practical and a responsible approach, joining a global consensus to take action, recognising we need a global solution to what is a global problem. And we have been able to reduce emissions by more than 20% since 2005, and at the same time strengthen our economy, grow our economy by around 45% in that time, and seen an additional 3 million people in work, Mr Speaker. So our commitment is what we have delivered in the past and we will deliver again in the future, which is lowering emissions and strengthening our economy and creating more jobs.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government is delivering both significant national infrastructure and local projects supporting our communities and regional economies? How will this benefit my home state of Victoria? And is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Nichols for his question and note the heritage of the area of Nichols, which is the home of Black Jack McEwen. And back in 1934, he actually entered Parliament and had a long and distinguished career, like the member for Nichols, at both a state and a federal level, has had a long and distinguished career. And I know, and we all hope, that delivery that he's achieved for the people of Nichols continues on. Mr Speaker, it's continued on in a range of ways. He's been absolutely instrumental within the Nationals in driving for the Inland Rail, which was going through the member for Nichols seat, and incredibly important for places such as the stone fruit producers in the member for Nichols seat, or the dairy producers in the member for Nichols seat, or the industry and the benefits it got from further construction in the member for Nichols seat. When it's concluded, it will ease congestion, removing 200,000 truck movements each year. It will reduce carbon emissions by 750,000 tonnes each year. One inland rail train carries the equivalent of 110 B-double trucks. And this is the sort of thing, this is the sort of inspiration, this is the sort of development which is so important in achieving a task that we're smart enough to put the investments into the things that achieve a task and also advance the lives of regional people. Now, the member for Nichols has not only been a great champion for the big projects, he's also been a great champion for the smaller projects. And the Shepparton City Council Maud Street Mall redevelopment, part of the social infrastructure, he was absolutely at the forefront of that, working with Mayor Kim O'Keefe. He also was instrumental, and especially in the Echuca-Moama Bridge. That was a massive project, and with the member for Riverina, they drove forward on that massive project. It was $320 million is that project. That's not the sort of development you get if you're relying on people who are basically, when you take away Lingiari, only represent about 150,000 square kilometres of this nation, while we represent about over 5 million square kilometres of this nation. But, Mr Speaker, he talks about alternate policies, and very important, because one of his greatest concerns, I imagine, especially around the stone fruit growers and the dairy farmers, is if legislation came in which were further laws that restricted their capacity, that imposed on their lives, that restricted their freedoms and their capacity to grow. And there's only one side of the chamber that's talking about bringing in legislation. In fact, the only thing we know they're bringing in, we don't know about anything else, is the Labor Party they're going to bring in the legislation. The legislation because they just don't believe in the ingenuity and they don't believe in the freedoms of the individual. They believe that what resides with the member of Grainler is the capacity to look after the people in Shepparton with legislation, laws and penalties.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask simply, will the Prime Minister now table the modelling for his so-called net zero plan?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The modelling will be released in the next few weeks, Mr Speaker. I've made that very clear. Very clear when we're releasing the modelling, Mr Speaker. I look forward to the modelling being
Members
released.
on my left.
When those opposite ever come up with a plan, Mr Speaker, they won't even tell us what their 2030 target is before Glasgow. I don't know what they're waiting for, Mr Speaker. I know what our target is. Our target that we're taking, Mr Speaker, is 26 to 28%. Talking about our policies.
Yes, it's okay, and I know what the question was too, which was very specific, and it was very short, and it doesn't take me long to remember it.
26 to 28%, Mr Speaker, is what our target is. That's what we took to the last election, and we're going to beat that target. And that's what I'll be telling people in Glasgow under our nationally determined contributions, that we expect for that to fall by 35%, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It was a very, very specific question, and the Prime Minister is not being relevant.
No, I just asked
it. It goes to the modelling.
Yeah,
will he table it?
I do just say there's an opportunity to briefly refer to the plan, but there's not an opportunity. I mean, the question was, would the Prime Minister table the modelling for his net zero plan? The Prime Minister's absolutely answered that question in saying it'll be released publicly in a few weeks' time, and he's had the opportunity to reflect briefly on the policy, but it's not an opportunity for the next 2 minutes to simply talk about the policy when he's only asked one question. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So yes, Australia has already achieved a 20% reduction in our emissions since 2005, which has seen also our economy grow by 45% over that same period of time. And, Mr Speaker, we are forecasting, projecting in our nationally determined contribution at Glasgow that we will beat that 26 to 28% target, and our emissions reduction by 2030 will be 35%. That's what we anticipate that to be, based on the work that has been done under the transparent process which the government has been long engaged in. And we know that under our plan, Mr Speaker, by the end of that
Prime
forecast
Minister,
period,
yeah,
I'm talking about the modelling.
Well, actually that wasn't clear.
I was about to make that point.
Okay, but if you're talking about the modelling, you need to make that clear.
And that shows, Mr Speaker, that under our plan, GDP's up 1.59%. Under our plan, it's about $2,000 per person better off a year, Mr Speaker. Under our plan, Mr Speaker, we are seeing a 5.6% increase in investment. That's what our plan's doing, Mr Speaker. We've looked at that. We've wrestled with these issues. We've worked through these issues, and we want to be assured. We want to be assured, Mr Speaker, that these outcomes can be achieved, particularly for rural and regional Australia. We've done the work to satisfy ourselves on that. We've done the work to satisfy ourselves that we can reach net zero by 2050 and grow our economy and support rural and regional economies, Mr Speaker. We're confident about that. That's why we're taking it forward. The Labor Party's not confident about anything. They don't even have a target for 2030.
This is not an opportunity to talk about alternative policies. The member for Kennedy.
Treasurer, in 30 years, per capita net national income has risen only 130%, yet housing and motor vehicle prices have risen over 600% and food over 230%. Affordable living now being beyond many Australians. Wouldn't the deregulation of building codes and land subdivisions, along with the capping down to 100%, the current unconscionable farm gate to family markup of 300% on food, wouldn't these measures stop 30% of our families collapsing into poverty?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Kennedy for his question, and I understand he's talking about cost of living, and it is true that a lot of Australians are doing it tough right now, particularly as a consequence of the largest economic shock since the Great Depression. But I can inform the member, and indeed the House, that household disposable income is up 5.8% since the start of the pandemic, Mr Speaker. And this is because we as a government have put around $300 billion of support into the economy, direct economic support for families and for businesses. And in the budget this year, I announced a number of other measures that go to the heart of cost of living. Indeed, since the pandemic, we have cut taxes by about $24 billion for Australians, Mr Speaker. But in the budget, we had $9.7 billion in childcare support. We, in the budget, had $9 billion for an additional support for JobSeeker, with the single largest increase since 1986, Mr Speaker. We had about $9 billion for homelessness and for housing, programs like Home Builder, but also Commonwealth Rent Assistance, which is so important. And so these programs are supporting the economy and supporting households who, as the member points out, are doing it very tough. But we can only invest in these measures when we have a strong economy. And I can tell the House that Australia is one of only 9 countries in the world to have a AAA credit rating from the 3 leading credit rating agencies. And we know that when we came to government, unemployment was at 5.7%. Today it's 4.6%, with unemployment gone below 5% for the first time in a decade. So I say to the honourable member, we as a government are committed to driving down taxes to put more money into people's pockets and to try to ease the cost of living with the investments that we're making in the energy sector, which has seen energy prices come down by around 10% from their peak. So whether it's childcare, whether it's housing, whether it's job seeker support for those who are out of work, whether it's our energy investments, we are focused on driving down the cost of living for all Australians.
Yeah. The member for Herbert has the call.
My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Morrison government's proven record of delivering tax cuts for businesses and families, strengthening our economic recovery and helping to drive unemployment to its lowest level in a decade? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, I thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Herbert, and I thank him for his service to Australia in the Australian Defence Force, Mr Speaker. Somebody who was injured in Afghanistan, someone who's worn the uniform with pride, and someone who represents, Australia's largest garrison city in Townsville, Mr Speaker, and supports our veterans. So we say thank you to the member for Herbert, and I thank you for this question. And he recognises that this side of the House, the coalition, Liberals and Nationals, are committed to creating more jobs and driving down taxes, Mr Speaker. Now, when we came to government, unemployment was 5.7%. Today it's 4.6%, and 1.4 million additional jobs have been created since we came to government. And when it comes to lower taxes, we have legislated through the parliament around $300 billion of income tax cuts. That means if you're a teacher in Townsville on $60,000, you are paying $6,480 less tax under our government as a result of the measures that we have passed on this side of the House. And if you're a small business with a turnover less than $50 million, you've seen your tax come down to 25% from 30%. And immediate expensing and the loss carry-back measures have seen an increase in investment across the country. In terms of machinery and equipment investment, we've seen about a 20% increase as a result of the business investment incentives that we have supported on this side of the House. So we're delivering lower taxes and we're delivering more jobs. And on top of that, we're investing in infrastructure, programs like Snowy 2.0, which are going to support around 5,000 jobs, and programs like the Western Sydney Airport, which will support around 11,000 jobs, and other programs like Inland Rail, Mr Speaker, which will support more than 20,000 jobs. And some very important infrastructure projects which are creating jobs and driving up productivity. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative policies to our approach to create more jobs and to lower taxes? Well, we know that those opposite support higher taxes, because they went to the last election with $387 billion of higher taxes, and the member for McMahon told Australians, if you don't like our policies, don't vote for them. And they took him literally, Mr Speaker. They took him literally. But now we know the member for Rankin is cooking up a family tax. Mr Speaker, on family businesses, 300,000 of them. A $27 billion tax on family businesses, Mr Speaker, that will leave businesses worse off as a result of Labor's addiction to high taxes. So we on this side of the House are committed to creating more jobs and lowering taxes for all Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What is the reason why he says he's releasing the modelling in a few weeks rather than now? Don't Australians deserve the right to see it?
The Prime Minister.
Of course, Mr Speaker, we'll be fully transparent about the policies as we have been, Mr Speaker, and we will release that modelling in the next few weeks. That's exactly what we'll do.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on Australia's vaccine program, including how booster vaccines will continue to protect Australian lives and livelihoods?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Moncrieff. I had the privilege of visiting with her the TRICARE aged care facility at Mermaid Beach, And not that long before, they had a positive case amongst one of their groundskeepers. All of the staff were doing their best, and all of the residents had been offered and given double vaccination for everyone who was willing to receive it. And that provided very important protection at a very important time. And that threat, which we've seen around the world, continues. Again, over 400,000 cases in the last 24 hours worldwide of COVID-19, and sadly 8,500 lives lost. And we are closing, very sadly, on more than 5 million lives lost worldwide officially, with the real rate likely to be far higher than that. Against that background, one of the things that we've sought to do is to ensure that we have as many Australians vaccinated as possible. And what we're seeing now is that across the country we are on the cusp of an 87.5% first dose and a 75% second dose rate. That second dose rate is climbing, and the first dose rate is continuing to increase around the country. South Australia, as the Prime Minister has said, has passed the 80% first dose rate today. Other states are closing on it, and already we have the ACT, New South Wales and Victoria with more than 90% of first doses around the country. In particular, we're now at 34.8 million doses around Australia, and what that means is that there is just over 1 million Australians to come forward to have their second doses to achieve that 80% national mark. And so we're on track and we're achieving that. And as General Fruin said on Sunday, there's enough vaccine in the country to ensure that every person who seeks to be vaccinated with a first or second has that opportunity. And today, the TGA has approved a booster shot, a third dose for those once they've reached 6 months or more, and that's available, and it will be available to all those who seek it. That vaccine is ready, and what that means is that we will have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, one of the most recently vaccinated populations, and one of the earliest countries in the world to have a whole-of-population booster program subject to the final advice by ATAGI. All of these things are coming together to provide protection for Australians, to give us some of the highest protection in the world, but also to allow that roadmap. And that roadmap takes form with, on the 1st of November, Australians being able to regain their freedoms and leave the country.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answers on net zero in this House. Can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm he signed up to net zero without seeing any Treasury modelling on the impact on regional Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. Just while I've been sitting back there in regards to this plan, I'm very encouraged by some of it, because for the long-term prospects for Australia's coal and gas sectors will depend on preferences from customers. I understand that. And the DISA modelling, which is on the next page, I just want to go through it. Coal metallurgical global ranking #1, coal thermal global ranking #2, LNG global ranking #2, iron ore #1, uranium #1, lithium #1, zinc #2 and copper #3. This is great, and I just had a look at it for the honourable member. The source, DISA Resources and Energy Quarterly, September 21. It's modelling. I'm very happy. I believe the people at DISA are probably proficient enough, probably a little bit better than me in determining those incredible rankings. I'm happy we've got them. I'm very encouraged by making sure that in working with my National Party colleagues that we talk about that we will remain one of the world's biggest producers and exporters of liquefied natural gas, and this is a great outcome. It talks about the ongoing use of coal. In fact, it talks about I think merely a 6% decline over the near future, but that belies the fact that currently we're exporting more coal at a higher price than we ever have before. The modelling seems pretty good. The modelling seems pretty good.
The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister outline to the House how our plan for net zero by 2050 will ensure that we strengthen our industries and create jobs as we bring down our emissions? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, I thank the member for Groom for his question. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and for his continued support for a technology-led approach to reducing emissions. As the member for the area in and around Toowoomba, he represents one of the great energy and agricultural hubs of the world, Mr Speaker, and he, like so many of his constituents, understands that technology-led approaches to reducing emissions using technologies like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, regenerating our soils is the key to maintaining a strong economy, strengthening our economy and bringing down emissions at the same time. And that's our plan, Mr Speaker. We've laid it out. Few countries in the world have, and those opposites certainly haven't, Mr Speaker. It's a plan that focuses on doing things the Australian way, Mr Speaker, the Australian way. It builds on the policies and initiatives that we've been announcing over a long period of time, including in recent months, Mr Speaker, and as a result of those policies and initiatives, emissions are more than 20% down since 2005. That's at a time where the economy has grown by 45%. And get this, Mr Speaker, exports during that time, when emissions have come down by 20.8%, exports have grown by more, product exports by more than 200%, Mr Speaker. That's success. That's what works. And our plan is about using what works. It respects the choices of Australians, households and businesses. And this is so crucial, Mr Speaker. Their right to choose. Their right to choose. The right of farmers to choose how they want to farm. The right of Australians to choose the vehicles they want to drive, the food they want to eat, Mr Speaker. It's a plan for prosperity and for the regions to excel, Mr Speaker. But I am asked about alternatives. And the alternative is those opposite. Seven times they've voted against the technology-led approach. The Leader of the Opposition describes it as absurd, but worse, Mr Speaker, time after time they have refused to tell Australians what their 2030 target is. But today they came into this place and they voted for a 60% emissions reduction target, Mr Speaker. Voted for a 60% emissions reduction target. Now, it's true the Leader of the Opposition described the member for Maribyrnong's target of 45% as a mistake. What no one realised is he was in favour of a 60% target, Mr Speaker. A 60% target. And he needs to explain which industries will be destroyed, which cattle are going to go, which mines are going to be closed, which industry is going to disappear, Mr Speaker, which regions are going to be destroyed. They need to explain all of this, Mr Speaker. Well, we've laid out our plan as technology-led. It's for the prosperity of Australia and Australians, Mr Speaker, and it respects the choice of all Australians.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to, again, the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer. Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware that the document that he was quoting from is not the modelling document? I ask again, can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm that he signed up to net zero without seeing the Treasury modelling on the impact on regional Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member once again for his question. And throughout the document it's talking about the DISA modelling, and I imagine DISA know what they're doing. I suspect they might know more than the honourable member himself, as, I don't know, maybe he's an expert in linear regression analysis, and maybe he can give us a little speech on the Rapson-Newton theory and go through a whole range of his acumen in this area. But I'm suspecting, I'm going way out on a limb here, that DISA knows more than he does. So I'm very encouraged. And of course we went through it. We diligently went through a full process of making sure that we went into bat for regional Australia, because the one thing we were looking for was to making sure that there was no legislation like you're going to bring forward and legislate out the workers in the Hunter Valley and legislate out the workers in central Queensland and legislate out the jobs from Newcastle and legislate out the towns of Muswellbrook and Singleton. Well, it's very important that we make... Now, I knew that would get under your skin. I knew that.
Well, I hadn't even asked him to resume his seat, but anyway, have you finished? No.
No, go on. I thought he was trying to say good day to me. And I didn't want to say good day to him, so I just took a break for a second. But what is really
well, maybe
important...
you can do that outside the House, hey?
What's really... I'll take your advice, Mr Speaker. And I was looking at this. This is great. Australian lithium exports could grow from $1 billion in 2020 to $10 billion by 2050. $34 billion a year further refined. Now, that's a good idea. And the Prime Minister and myself, are you coming up this time
no,
to say
the Deputy
good day,
Prime Minister can resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on direct relevance, the question goes to the modelling document. It's in two parts. Both refer to the modelling document, and the Deputy Prime Minister is not referring to it at any point.
The Deputy Prime Minister was asked about his previous answer about that document and a separate modelling document that the Prime Minister said will be released in the next couple of weeks. I've allowed him to talk about the modelling he's seen, but he needs to really either come back to the question or wrap up his answer.
Mr Speaker, it is not exceptional that you trust competent modelling agencies. It's not exceptional that you would think that DISA was competent at their job, that McKinsey was competent at their job, that the departmental officials didn't walk in off the street, and so even unless you've got the expert knowledge, which I presume the member for Watson doesn't have, then it would be better to rely on the people who are expert on it, and that's people such as DISA.
The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is investing in technology we need to reduce emissions both here and around the world? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Curtin for her question. As a former Vice-Chancellor and researcher, she knows the power of technology to solve hard problems in Australia and around the world, Mr Speaker, and she knows that a technology-led approach is the right way to get to net zero by 2050 in a way that reconciles a strong economy, job creation, investment, Mr Speaker, with bringing down emissions. And she trusts the Australian people that when low emissions technologies come to cost competitiveness, they deploy them. And they're doing exactly that in her electorate, Mr Speaker. They are doing exactly that in her electorate, where there are 15,000 households with solar cells on the roofs, Mr Speaker. Solar cells, I should say, where 90% of the cells around the world have Australian technology in them. We've shaped that technology, Mr Speaker, and we've played an extraordinary role in bringing down emissions, not just here in Australia, but around the world. Now, we as Australians, trust our colleagues, our fellow Australians, to make the choices that are right for them about the vehicles they drive, the food they eat, Mr Speaker, the electricity they buy. And we know that low emissions technologies, when they make sense, when they're cost competitive, they'll adopt them. And that's why we're focused on reducing the cost of those technologies to bring them to the point where Australians deploy them because it's in their interest. Now, that includes technology like carbon capture and storage, Mr Speaker, and we've developed an emissions reduction fund methodology we've announced in recent months so that we can credit abatement from new carbon capture and storage projects. We've committed $250 million to carbon capture and storage hubs. We know that'll provide up to 1,500 jobs, Mr Speaker, nearly all of which will be in regional areas. But it's not just us, Mr Speaker. It's not just us. Joe Biden, the US President, of course, has said that the US will double down on carbon capture and storage. The IPCC and the IEA have said this is a critical technology for the world to meet net zero goals, Mr Speaker. The UK is investing $1 billion in carbon capture and storage, which will reduce their emissions by 20 to 30 million tonnes per annum, Mr Speaker, but I am asked about alternatives. And the fact is that those opposite rule out technologies. They rule them out. They rule them out, like carbon capture and storage. They have voted time and time against technologies like these, Mr Speaker. And we know why. We know why. Because their real target is not net zero, Mr Speaker, it's zero. They want to see industries like agriculture, manufacturing and mining wiped out. No fossil fuels, they want them all gone, Mr Speaker. They want to see these industries wiped out. Well, that's not the Australian way. That's not the Australian way. We will reconcile right across regional Australia and the rest of Australia strong economy with emissions reduction.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't the Prime Minister legislate net zero by 2050? Is it because he's worried about members of his own government crossing the floor?
Good question.
The Prime Minister?
No, Mr Speaker. No. Mr Speaker, our plan backs in what Australians are doing. We have met and we have beaten our Kyoto targets, Mr Speaker. They weren't legislated. They weren't legislated, Mr Speaker. We're going to meet and we're going to beat our Paris targets that we set at 26 to 28%. We had this discussion at the last election. Those opposite said they didn't believe that our plans would meet that target. They said it won't happen. Other commentators said it wouldn't happen, Mr Speaker. They said the same thing about our 2020 targets. Yeah. They made all the same criticisms and they made all the same noise that they're making today, Mr Speaker, about our plans for 2050. But guess what? We met 2020, Mr Speaker. There aren't that many countries that can say that they just didn't meet it, Mr Speaker, that we beat it by almost a full year of emissions by Australia, Mr Speaker. We beat that target in 2020, and in 2030, when we go to Glasgow, we'll be able to say that our projections, which are included in our nationally determined contribution, will see emissions reduced, we expect, by 35% by 2030. So, Mr Speaker, Australians know what our policies are, they know what they're designed to achieve, they know what they have met, Mr Speaker, they know how those targets have been beaten, and they know how we plan to get there with technologies, Mr Speaker, which we know will secure the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. Australians, of course, want us to achieve net zero by 2050, Mr Speaker, but they don't want a blank cheque. They don't want to be signed up by a blank cheque, which is what the Labor Party want to do with their legislation, Mr Speaker. They don't want the mandates to come down and be told what to do, either on their farm or on their business or in their home or in their car. They want to be trusted, Mr Speaker. We trust Australians to be able to go forward and do these things, just like we trusted them to go out and get vaccinated. The Leader of the Opposition thought they had to be bribed to do that, Mr Speaker. We believe in the integrity of Australians and their commitment to do what's right by Australia. We don't think they need to be mandated. We don't think they need those sorts of things, Mr Speaker, because we know they want to achieve it, and we know that's true because we've already seen emissions fall by over 20%, Mr Speaker, on 2005 levels, and at the same time our economy has grown by 45%. We've got 1 million people back in jobs in manufacturing in this country, Mr Speaker. Under Labor, 1 in 8 jobs in manufacturing gone. And on electricity prices, Mr Speaker, under our government on the latest inflation figures, they've gone up by 3%. Since we were elected. Under Labor, they went up by 101%, Mr Speaker.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government's technology-driven approach to reducing emissions, which includes its significant investment in protecting and improving Australia's ancient soils, will ensure our agriculture industry can continue to grow and thrive?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Cowper for his question. He represents a very rich agricultural region. He understands the important role that agriculture will play not just in this technology roadmap in reducing emissions, but what it's already achieved. the agriculture and land sector have reduced emissions by over 55% since 2005, but we've increased agricultural production from $36 billion to over $73 billion over that same period. We've done that through investing in technology and, more importantly, through our soils. 95% of what we produce in the agriculture sector comes from our soils. And there is a symbiotic relationship between our soils and reducing carbon, because the more that we can put into our carbon we can put into our soils, the better agricultural produce that we produce. And so we are putting investments through our national soil strategies to make sure that we can abate more carbon through our soils and increase agricultural production. That is common sense. That is what this plan is about. And we're doing that with specific programs like $67 million going to household waste, to work with councils to use organic waste and food waste to go into compost, to save and abate that carbon back into the soil to produce better crops, better protein, from using the just simple modems of working with councils in making sure we can use that carbon. We're also working with $20 million in the Science Challenge to ensure those gaps, those knowledge gaps in understanding our soils and how they can be used better to get better productivity. We are the best minds to be able to achieve that. Well, there's $120 million working with farmers to incentivise them to do more soils tests and to also use the data that came out of their previous soil tests to bring together a greater database, not just around carbon abatement but also the productivity of their land. $54 million, and also having boots on the ground, extension officers working with farmers through that data to be able to understand what their management practices should look like. There's also $40 million for our soil CRC that is ensuring that the collection of this data is collaborated and used across sectors to ensure that the productivity and profitability of our farmers and the abatement of that carbon works to our farmers' advantage but also to us reducing our emissions. We're also working through the Minister for Energy with over $36 million in the soil challenge to crack the code of reducing the cost of a soil carbon test, to bring it down from over $30 a hectare to $3 a hectare. This will incentivise farmers to be able to take advantage of the more than 90 million hectares of agricultural production area that they can not only produce better crops, better protein, but they can also abate carbon and help us play an integral part of meeting our international commitments. That has the potential to actually abate nearly 90 million tonne a year in carbon abatement, going a long way to living up to our international commitments. This is a common-sense Australian way of solving an international problem and increasing Australian agricultural productivity along the way.
The member for Wills.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that nearly a third of the emissions reductions he hopes to claim for his net zero policy by 2050 come from technological innovations that don't exist yet, and global technology trends which are out of Australia's control?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that 15% of the emissions reduction that come as a result of the government's plan will be from global technology trends. Mr Speaker, I confirm that it includes 20% reductions that have already occurred. Mr Speaker, our policies have already seen a 20% reduction in emissions, which is greater than the United States. It's greater than the OECD average, Mr Speaker. It's greater than Japan. It's greater than Canada. It's greater than New Zealand, Mr Speaker. Australia's actions on reducing climate change, reducing emissions, Australia's outcomes in reducing emissions speak far louder than the claims and the words of others, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that 40% of those reductions comes from the technology investment roadmap technologies which go to clean hydrogen and getting that under $2 a kilo, ultra-low-cost solar at under $15 per megawatt hour, energy storage getting that under $100 per megawatt hour, low-emission steel and aluminium steel production under $700 per tonne and under $2,200 per tonne, that we can get carbon capture and storage, something opposed by the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, down to under $20 per tonne of CO2. The Leader of the Opposition interjects, Mr Speaker. He says it's not true. Well, if that's not true, Mr Speaker, why is he voting against it in the Senate with the Labor Party, Mr Speaker?
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on direct relevance.
You abolish the fund.
Hey, the Leader of the Opposition.
Fraud.
Leader of the Opposition. I'm trying to hear the Manager of Opposition Business.
On direct relevance, the question goes to two parts of that document. He's not referring to either of them at the moment. It goes to the global technology trends part of it and the technological innovations that don't exist yet. He's now going to other sections, and that's where he's been spending most of his answer.
Yes, no, the Prime Minister's been referring to a number of things in the answer. The question asked him to confirm those two things, so in the time available, I'm just going to ask the Prime Minister to just come back to the question.
Mr Speaker, I was outlining the entire emissions reduction, of which those other two factors sit within the context of. So I said 40% is on those technologies we're already funding and supporting through the lower emissions technology roadmap, Mr Speaker. There is 10 to 20% on international and domestic offsets. And, Mr Speaker, there is up to 15% on further technology breakthroughs. And I say to the Leader of the Opposition of the Labor Party, what have they got against technology, Mr Speaker? Why do they not have a confidence that in the next 30 years, that in the world today, Mr Speaker, we will not see technology breakthroughs which will ensure that we'll be able to close the gap? If that's the case, they should never use one of these because they don't believe they exist, Mr Speaker. An iPhone would never have been existing if it was based on the assumptions of the Leader of the Opposition. He wouldn't think any of these things had happened. We wouldn't have had a COVID vaccine, Mr Speaker, because it hadn't been developed 2 years ago, not even 1 year ago, Mr Speaker, or not much more than 1 year ago. So, Mr Speaker, yes, it's true. I have more confidence in technological innovation and science, Mr Speaker, than I do in taxes and regulations put on the Australian people by the Labor Party.
The member for Ford has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts, representing the Attorney-General. Will the Minister please inform the House how the Morrison government's strong record on online safety will be further supported through online privacy reforms?
The Minister representing the Attorney-General.
Well, I do thank the member for Ford, who's got a long-standing commitment to keeping Australians safe, including safe online, as well as when they interact in the physical town square. He's determined, as all on this side of the House are determined, that people should be safe when they interact in the digital town square as well. And just this week, we've seen further progress by this government in this important policy area with the release of an exposure draft designed to enable the creation of a binding online privacy code for social media services, data brokers and other large online platforms. And this is a great piece of work from the Attorney-General and the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister for Mental Health. It's designed to provide Australians with more transparency and more control about how their personal information is being handled. And critically, Mr Speaker, what's proposed under this code is that social media platforms operating in Australia will be required to take all reasonable steps to verify the age of users, to take all reasonable steps to verify parental or guardian consent for children under 16 years and require that the handling of children's personal information on their platforms is fair and reasonable, with the best interests of the child being the primary consideration. Mr Speaker, the Online Privacy Code is the next step in the Morrison government's cohesive and comprehensive plan to keep Australians safe online. It's the next building block in our defences, and it builds on our tough new Online Safety Act. It builds on our strong new industry codes to protect Australians against abhorrent and violent content. It builds on new powers to order tech companies to report on how they're keeping people safe and issue hefty fines of up to $550,000 for companies if they don't respond. It builds on our successful cyberbullying scheme for children. It builds on the 25,000 times our school toolkits have been downloaded. It builds on professional teacher programs that have reached 5,300 educators. It builds on our world-first adult cyber abuse scheme. It builds on the $15 million we provided for extra investigators to support victims of abuse. It builds on our new powers for the E-Safety Commissioner to unmask anonymous trolls. It builds on
takedown powers for intimate images shared online without consent. It builds on a $125 million funding commitment for the eSafety Commissioner over the next 4 years. It builds on our commitment to develop technology to support women in finding intimate images put up without their authority in the darkest places of the web. It builds on our achievement of reaching 1 million senior Australians through our Be Connected program. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government strongly committed to keeping Australians safe online and a whole series of practical measures to do that.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm he committed $13 million of taxpayers' money to advertising his climate policy before he even had one? Can the Prime Minister confirm that the only jobs created by his policy so far are for the Minister for Resources and advertising executives? Why is it always about spin and never about substance from this Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No, Mr Speaker, the member's question and the presumptions in it are false.
Correct. Rubbish.
The member for Ryan has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is backing our law enforcement agencies to tackle the evil crime of child abuse and to make our communities safer?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you, and I thank the member for his question. And I recognise the significant work that he has done as chair of both the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Law Enforcement and also the Parliamentary Friends of ACE. Mr Speaker, nothing is more important than the safety and security of our children. And the coalition government has always been serious about tackling this insidious crime. Now, this morning we launched our country's first national strategy to prevent and respond to child sexual abuse. And this strategy, this new strategy, will further focus our work over the next decade. It includes over $131 million to resource our law enforcement efforts, which build on our record investment to establish the world-leading Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. Now, sadly, last year alone, the centre received over 22,000 reports of child sexual exploitation. That's an average of over 60 a day. And we all know that not every instance would be reported. So that is a terrible statistic that we must all work hard to make sure that we can reduce. Now, clearly, with the COVID pandemic, there has been more opportunities for children to be online, and it's also an opportunity for predators to be out there grooming children. This is something that this government is very committed to doing its best to stamp out, and we're doing that by giving police and law enforcement agencies some pretty tough new powers. Mr Speaker, can I also say that this Friday is Day for Daniel, Australia's largest child safety education and awareness day, and I pay tribute to the work of Bruce and Denise Morecambe, who I met with recently. They worked tirelessly to make our community safer in the memory of their son. Their work is greatly appreciated by both ACE and the AFP, and I know that many Australians right around the country will be supporting Day for Daniel on Friday. The AFP and federal agencies will always be ready to support the work of state police forces when it comes to crimes against children. And they are currently doing that in the case of 4-year-old Cleo Smith, who disappeared from a campsite in Western Australia. Our thoughts are with the family, and I can assure them that the advanced capabilities of federal law enforcement are being deployed to aid local efforts to find Cleo. Australians can be certain that we will continue to equip our law enforcement and intelligence agencies with the tools and the resources that they need to combat this very serious crime, and especially crimes against children.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I associate the Labor Party with the comments of the Minister and encourage people to to participate in the Day for Daniel and congratulate all those involved in that day, and certainly along with the rest of the House and the rest of Australia, we all want to see young Cleo found safely.
The member for Lilly.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister support Labor's plan to cut taxes on electric vehicles, making them cheaper for Australian families?
The Minister for Industry has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about our policy on electric vehicles, and our policy...
Members on my left, the Minister was about 6 seconds in. Can I just listen to him for a second?
Our policy is to facilitate the choice of all Australians. Choice, Mr Speaker. Now, as the cost comes down, with all technologies, they get deployed, Mr Speaker. They get deployed, and we encourage the global manufacturers of electric vehicles to keep driving those costs down, and our policy is focused on making sure the infrastructure is in place to support the choices of all Australians. And, Mr Speaker, we're making significant investment in that infrastructure. Indeed, through round one of the Future Fuels Fund, we're providing $25 million to ARENA to support more than 400 new charging stations, Mr Speaker. We are facilitating the choice of Australians. Those opposite think they know better, Mr Speaker. They want to make the choices for Australians.
The member for Bass.
My question's to the Minister assisting the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Will the Minister outline to the House the importance of the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse, launched today by the Prime Minister with the support of every state and territory leader?
The Minister assisting the Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Bass for her important and strong advocacy on these issues. As someone who can only imagine the lasting impact of these heinous crimes against children, I've been rocked with what I've learned as the Minister responsible for the National Office of Child Safety. And that's why, appropriately, I acknowledge victim survivors, their advocates, their families, and those that work to support them. I also acknowledge Steve Irons, my predecessor, who did much of the work in this role. Sadly, Mr Speaker, the rate of child sexual abuse is increasing. Between 2014 and 19, Mr Speaker, the number of recorded sexual assaults against children and young people increased by 21%. That's from 13,353 to 16,140. Reports of online child sexual abuse has increased as well. During the COVID lockdown last year, that increased by 122%. Sadly, the reach of Australian perpetrators also extends overseas. We have no greater responsibility as a government to protect our children and to ensure their safety. Today, the Prime Minister and I launched the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse. We announced $307.5 million for its initial implementation. This is over and above the commitments of the individual states and territories for them to fulfil their responsibilities. The National Strategy is a 10-year whole-of-nation framework for coordinating an approach to preventing and responding to child sexual abuse. It has the backing of all state and territory leaders. It aims to reduce the risk, extent and impact of child sexual abuse and related harms in Australia. There are 5 key themes: awareness raising, education and building safe kids' cultures, supporting and empowering victims and survivors, enhancing national approaches to children with harmful sexual behaviours, offender prevention and intervention, and improving the evidence base. This strategy responds to the 100 of the Royal Commission recommendations and goes further. Since 2018, the National Office of Child Safety has been consulting extensively to develop the strategy. These consultations built on the Royal Commission findings and the experience of victims and survivors. The bulk of the consultations in relation to the strategy occurred between 2018 and 20. Consultations throughout 2021 focused heavily on how government and non-government agencies would implement the finalising of the strategy's vision and objectives. The National Strategy recognises that every child and young person has the right to be protected and to be safe from sexual abuse. It recognises those who have experienced child sexual abuse are still dealing with the impacts. It recognises that everyone has a role to play to respond to and to prevent child sexual abuse.
The member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answers on net zero in this House. Given the Deputy Prime Minister has described climate change as, I quote, just the biggest scam that this nation has ever seen concocted, what can we expect the Deputy Prime Minister to say about Glasgow and net zero when he becomes acting Prime Minister tomorrow night?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member for a question. I must admit I have to go a long way back to find that quote, but I'm happy for you to provide it to me. But what is really important is that when the Prime Minister goes to Glasgow, he'll be able to clearly point out that we will not be legislating any of the people in your electorate in Eden-Monaro out of a job. We won't be doing that. We'll be making sure the dairy farmers in Eden-Monaro are not legislated out by a form of legislation that your side of the House won't even tell us about. You won't tell us about your legislation. So I presume that the people in Eden-Monaro, the dairy farmers, will be concerned that the Labor Party legislation may go towards such things as methane emissions from your dairy herd. And that would be a big concern to the people of Bega, to know that the prospect of legislation that goes into the hearts of every coffee shop up and down Bega, that could have the expectation of the reduction of farming income for the people of Bega, is being proposed by the party that you are a member of. Because we'll be saying quite clearly that we make sure that there is no legislation that imposes on the freedoms and takes the place of the ingenuity that always resides with people who have taken us to a point where we have met and beat every target that we have had before us. Met and beat every target that we had before us. So when the Prime Minister goes to Glasgow, he will also know that the coalition are 100% behind the plan that he has brought forward. And we will also say, because I was looking through it, in Appendix 6, it was talking about the expansion of uranium mining and how important that is, how important that industry is. And we will be standing behind that. And I know, well, actually, I don't know whether the Labor Party you don't really support the coal mining industry and you don't really support the mining industry. And I'd say that other people who are watching Glasgow will be very concerned. They'll be very concerned about the legislation that brings in the laws that outlaws the prospects of regional Australia. They'll be very concerned if that was ever to be brought about by the legislation that your side of the House proposes.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. Will the Minister update the House on the progress of the Morrison-Joyce government's COVID-19 vaccine rollout in regional, rural and remote Australia?
The Minister for Regional Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Mallee for that question and compliment her both on her pre-parliamentary career as a social worker and setting up the Zoe Support charity. And she's been a dogged defender of the vaccine restrictions and cross-border problems that her constituents have had, and developed border bubble policies and the like. Now, the seat of Mallee, a massive electorate like many in Australia, the size of Ireland, has, like other places in regional Australia, had multiple primary care sites, 90 in total, along with the help of the Flying Doctor Service, the AUSMAT teams, the Defence Vaccine Outreach teams, to get comparable rates. And areas in her electorate have over 90% in some areas, first doses. But in the last week, 4,000 people in Mildura, the heart of Mallee, got themselves vaccinated. So the completed doses rate has gone up to 73%. Now, both in the outbreak in Western New South Wales and in Northern Victoria, rapid antigen tests have been really helpful bit of technology to rapidly isolate and get answers in these regional far-flung places. And I can confirm to the member and other members in regional Australia, I've been in touch with the major retailers, Coles, Woolies, IGA and the Pharmacy Guild, and they have assured me that regional Australia will be getting rapid antigen tests that people can use at home or in the workplace without a medical professional at the same time as the rest of Australia. Now, unfortunately, in some areas in regional Australia, the vaccination rate among some of the more remote communities with high numbers of Indigenous haven't been as good. There is a lag in them catching up, but just in this last little period, in the week or so, 3.9% of the Indigenous population that hadn't been vaccinated have. So the message is, if you are not vaccinated yet, it's never too late. You can get, going forward, you'll be able to get a booster dose, or if you haven't been vaccinated, you can get it from your GP or your pharmacy or one of the hubs, and there is rapid antigen tests coming to help manage stuff. So regional Australia, you're well looked after as we open up and get our life back. Thanks.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.